You are not the one thinking your thoughts. Not most of them. You are not the ones that decide, before the day has properly begun, whether this year will finally be different or whether it will quietly resemble the last one. Those thoughts arrive before you invite them. They carry opinions about what you're capable of, what you deserve, what's realistic for someone with your particular history. And they sound exactly like you. That's the part nobody warns you about. Not that unwanted thoughts exist, everyone knows that. But that the thoughts doing the most damage to your financial life, your relationships, your sense of what's possible, those thoughts don't feel foreign. They feel like honest self-assessment. Like the voice of experience. Like you, being real with yourself. They aren't. They are patterns. Established long before you had any capacity to question them. Running on a frequency so consistent it stopped feeling like a pattern and started feeling like reality. And here's the thing about patterns, they can be changed. Not through the kind of effort that leaves you exhausted by noon. Not through willpower or positive thinking or any approach that tries to fight the thought on its own level. Through something that operates underneath the thought entirely. By the time this ends, you'll understand exactly what that is. And why everything you've tried before may have been aimed at precisely the wrong place. If you've made it this far, it's because you're determined to have a life of success. So I invite you to subscribe to the channel, because every video will help you develop the mindset that attracts wealth, prosperity, and new opportunities every day. Napoleon Hill understood something about the mind that most people in his era weren't equipped to fully receive. Not because they lacked intelligence, because what he was pointing at required a level of honest self-examination that is genuinely uncomfortable. And most people, when given the choice between uncomfortable truth and comfortable assumption, choose the assumption without realizing they've made a choice at all. What he understood was this: the thoughts that shape a life aren't primarily the ones a person is aware of having. They're the ones operating below awareness, the automatic, pre-conscious stream running continuously beneath deliberate thinking, filtering reality, generating emotional responses, and producing behavior that the conscious mind then explains after the fact, as if it had been in charge the whole time. It wasn't. The conscious mind, the part you experience as you, the part following this conversation, is not the primary driver of your behavior. It's more like the spokesperson, the part that narrates what's already been decided at a deeper level and presents that narration as reasoning. This is why knowing what you should do and actually doing it can feel like entirely different things. Why a decision made in genuine clarity doesn't survive contact with the ordinary pressures of an ordinary day. Why the resolution that felt completely real at midnight has lost most of its conviction by morning. Not weakness. Architecture. The architecture of a mind running two layers simultaneously, one visible, one not. Where the invisible layer has been executing the same programs for so long that its outputs have become indistinguishable from instinct, from personality, from just who you are. Hill called the deeper layer the subconscious, and he was precise about something most people miss when they encounter his work. He wasn't describing a mystical force or a spiritual reservoir. He was describing a functional system, one that operates according to consistent, observable principles and can be deliberately worked with once those principles are understood. The first principle is the one most people find hardest to accept. The subconscious doesn't evaluate the thoughts it receives. It accepts them, not selectively, not based on whether they're accurate or whether they serve you. Based on one criterion only: repetition. What gets repeated gets recorded. What gets recorded becomes operating truth. And operating truth shapes behavior at a level that conscious intention alone rarely reaches. Think about the thoughts that run most frequently through your mind about your potential. About what's realistic for someone with your background, your history of attempts, your current distance from where you want to be. You didn't choose most of those thoughts. They arrived through exposure, through the environment you grew up in, through the repeated messages of people whose voices carried authority in your formative years, through experiences the subconscious absorbed and converted into standing conclusions about how things work. Those conclusions are running right now, beneath this conversation, quietly shaping what registers as possible and what gets filtered out before reaching the level where you could actually act on it. And here's what changes everything. If the subconscious accepts thoughts based on repetition, if the programs running beneath your conscious life were installed through consistent exposure to certain kinds of input, then the same mechanism that installed them can replace them, not override them through effort, not suppress them through willpower, replace them at the level where they actually live through the same process that built them. But that process isn't what most people assume it is. And the assumption most people carry about how to change their thinking is exactly what keeps the thinking from changing. The assumption most people carry is that changing your thinking means controlling your thoughts, catching them as they arise, monitoring the mental stream, intercepting the unhelpful ones before they produce their effect, and replacing them, through conscious effort, with something more constructive. Staying vigilant, alert to what's passing through and ready to intervene whenever something damaging appears. This approach isn't wrong, but it addresses the symptom rather than the source. And treating symptoms while the source remains untouched is one of the most exhausting things a human being can attempt. Because the source keeps producing, the monitoring never stops, and the effort required eventually exceeds what's sustainably available. Which is why most people who try this experience an initial period of apparent progress followed by a gradual return to baseline. The patterns they were interrupting reassert themselves. And the conclusion that most naturally follows, that they simply lack the discipline required, that this works for other people but not for them, is the wrong conclusion drawn from the right observation. The observation is accurate. The approach wasn't holding. Not because of anything wrong with the person, because thought monitoring is a conscious-level intervention applied to a subconscious-level problem. And the conscious mind, however determined, doesn't have reliable access to the layer where the problem actually lives. Hill wasn't interested in what people thought consciously. He was interested in what the subconscious had accepted as true, because that acceptance was generating the automatic patterns that conscious effort was then struggling to manage. His insight was structural. You don't change the output by intercepting it. You change the source producing it. Think about a river that keeps flooding a town. The conventional response is better barriers, stronger defenses, more sophisticated systems for managing the water when it arrives. Those systems help, temporarily, the way thought monitoring helps temporarily. But the river keeps producing. The source hasn't changed. And eventually, maintaining the barriers requires more than the town has. The alternative isn't to fight the river. It's to change what's feeding it upstream. The subconscious is fed by what it repeatedly receives, through sensory input, emotional experience, the images and internal states that receive consistent attention. Change what it receives consistently, and the output begins shifting. Not immediately, not in a straight line, but at the level where the change actually needs to happen. Hill identified specific mechanisms through which this feeding can be done deliberately. Ways of introducing new material into the subconscious with enough consistency and emotional weight to begin displacing what's been running there. But before those mechanisms can work, before any deliberate input reaches the subconscious with the force required to shift what's already established, something else has to happen first. Something most people skip because it feels like it should already be in place. And its absence is exactly why the mechanisms, applied without it, produce results that feel real for a while and then quietly dissolve back into the familiar. What has to happen first is clarity about what you're actually trying to change. Not the general desire for better outcomes. Not the broad awareness that something in your thinking is producing results you don't want. Something more specific than any of that. The precise identification of the belief underneath the thought, the one generating the pattern you keep experiencing. Most people never get this specific. And without this specificity, the work that follows is like repairing a leak without knowing where it is. You can apply pressure to the system, introduce new inputs, Work with genuine commitment and still find the output returning to the same shape, because the specific source was never identified clearly enough to be directly addressed. Hill called this the starting point of all achievement, definiteness, not as an abstract principle, as a practical requirement. The mind works with what it's given. Give it something vague, and it produces vague results. Give it something precise, and it has something real to work with. The question isn't, what do I want my thinking to look like in general? The question is, what specific belief, running beneath my awareness, is producing the specific result I keep experiencing? That question is harder to answer than it sounds, because the beliefs doing the most damage aren't dramatic or obviously negative. They're the quiet, matter-of-fact conclusions that feel less like thoughts and more like observations. Thoughts like, this is just how things work for someone like me. Or, I've been here before and I know how it ends. Or, things seem to come together for other people, but my timing has never been quite right. None of those feel like limiting beliefs. They feel like honest assessments, like the reasonable conclusions of someone paying attention to their own life. But they are beliefs, operating as truth, shaping what gets reached for and what gets ruled out before the conscious mind has any say. Finding them requires a specific quality of attention, honest, patient, genuinely curious rather than defensive. The willingness to look at your own recurring patterns and ask, without judgment, what conclusion about yourself or the world would have to be true for this to keep repeating. That question, held honestly, usually surfaces something that has been operating for years without being named. And the moment it's named, the moment a belief is seen clearly as a belief rather than experienced as reality, its authority begins to loosen, not disappear. Loosen, which is exactly the opening the work that follows requires. Because the subconscious cannot be given a replacement for something it hasn't begun to release. But a belief brought into conscious view, identified specifically, seen for what it is, has already started losing the unquestioned status that gave it power. From that loosening, the actual work of replacement can begin. Before we go further, go to the comments right now and write "I believe." Not as a general declaration, as a personal statement that a different pattern is available to you, that the thoughts currently shaping your life are not permanent, not fixed, not the final word on what you're capable of. Hill understood that stating a new belief outside the privacy of your own mind begins the process of the subconscious treating it as a real possibility rather than an abstract wish. Write "I believe" in the comments. Then stay, because what comes next is where the replacement actually begins. The replacement doesn't begin with a new thought. It begins with a new feeling. This is the distinction that separates people who successfully change their mental patterns from those who understand intellectually that change is possible and still find themselves, months later, operating from the same underlying programs. The difference isn't effort or commitment or the quality of the new thoughts being introduced. It's whether those thoughts carry genuine feeling or whether they're being processed at the level of information alone. Hill was precise about this in a way most people underemphasize. The subconscious doesn't update in response to words. It updates in response to emotionally charged experience. And the difference between a thought that carries emotional weight and one that doesn't is the difference between input that reaches the subconscious and input that gets processed at the surface and released without leaving a mark. Think about how easily you recall a memory with strong emotion attached to it. Something from years ago that arrives with the same felt quality it had when it was new. The emotion hasn't faded the way factual details have, because the subconscious stores experience through emotional imprint, not logical record keeping. What mattered emotionally gets held. What didn't, doesn't. Which means the new thoughts being introduced need to matter, not conceptually, emotionally. They need to carry a felt sense of reality rather than the thin, unconvincing quality of something rehearsed without genuine investment. This is where most attempts at thought replacement fail. The new thought gets introduced correctly, identified, constructed, repeated, but delivered without feeling. repeated the way you'd repeat a phone number being memorized. Present, technically, but hollow. And the subconscious, which distinguishes genuine experience from performance with extraordinary accuracy, doesn't update in response to performance. Hill described what he called autosuggestion as requiring emotional faith, not enthusiasm or excitement, but the cultivated capacity to generate genuine felt experience of a new reality before that reality exists externally. To inhabit the new thought rather than observe it. To feel its truth rather than think about feeling its truth. That distinction between inhabiting and observing is where the practice lives or dissolves. Consider the difference between watching someone eat something and eating it yourself. Both involve the same food. The observer has all the relevant information, but the experience is categorically different. One is information, the other is experience. And the body responds to experience in a way it never responds to information alone. The subconscious works identically. A new thought observed from a distance, considered, evaluated, found reasonable, produces a fundamentally different effect than the same thought inhabited from the inside. Felt as present rather than pending. Experienced as real rather than aimed for. Developing that capacity, dropping below mental commentary into the direct felt experience of a different internal reality, is the actual practice. It develops through repetition, through the daily return to that quality of internal experience, until what initially required effort becomes gradually more accessible. But there's something specific about the conditions under which this practice produces its full effect. Something Hill identified that most approaches to thought change either miss entirely or address too briefly to matter. The conditions that make the practice work aren't complicated, but they're specific. And specificity matters more than most people realize, because the subconscious responds differently depending on the state the mind is in when new material is introduced. Not all moments of input carry equal weight. Some reach the deeper layer with considerably more force than others. Using those moments deliberately, rather than practicing at random intervals, is what separates genuine change from consistent effort that barely moves the needle. Hill identified two windows in particular: the period immediately before sleep and the period immediately after waking, not for any mystical reason, but because of what the mind is doing in them. In both windows, the conscious mind is operating with reduced intensity. The filtering mechanism that runs at full strength during ordinary waking hours, evaluating incoming information based on its consistency with existing beliefs, is partially suspended. The boundary between conscious and subconscious becomes more permeable. Material introduced in this state reaches deeper, with less resistance, than the same material introduced midday. Think about why dreams carry such emotional weight. Images and narratives produced during sleep feel real in a way that daytime imagination rarely achieves, because the subconscious, with the conscious editor offline, receives them without the layer of evaluation that would otherwise reduce their impact. The same content the waking mind would partially reject gets received directly. The practice Hill described uses this permeability deliberately. In the minutes before sleep, when the mind is moving toward that threshold, and in the minutes after waking, before the full weight of daily concerns has reasserted itself, those are the windows where new material introduced with genuine emotional investment reaches the subconscious with the least resistance and the greatest potential for real imprint. What gets introduced isn't elaborate, not extended visualizations or complex mental constructions. The felt experience of the belief being installed, held, not observed, inhabited for the duration of that window with whatever emotional investment can be genuinely generated, not performed, not manufactured, genuinely felt, even imperfectly, even briefly, even when the old thought attempts to reassert itself during the practice. Consistency matters more than the intensity of any single session. The subconscious updates through repetition, And the repetition of genuine felt experience in these high-permeability windows produces a cumulative effect that feels imperceptible in the short run and becomes undeniable over time. But there's a specific obstacle almost everyone encounters when they begin practicing consistently. One that doesn't arrive as difficulty or resistance or anything you'd expect from something genuinely challenging. It arrives as boredom. And boredom, in this context, is one of the most effective ways the existing program defends itself against being replaced. Boredom is the old program's most sophisticated defense. Not fear, not resistance, not the dramatic internal conflict most people expect when attempting genuine change. Boredom, the quiet, deflating sense that what you're doing isn't working, isn't producing anything visible enough to justify the continued investment of attention. It arrives reliably, usually within the first week of consistent practice. And it arrives with a quality that makes it particularly effective. It doesn't feel like the program defending itself. It feels like honest feedback, like the grounded recognition that this approach isn't for you, that you've given it a fair attempt, and that the absence of visible results is itself the result. That interpretation is almost always wrong, but it's convincing, because it arrives at exactly the moment when the practice is beginning to accumulate, when the repetition has been consistent enough to introduce genuine competition in the subconscious between the old belief and the new one. When the old program, for the first time, is actually being threatened. Hill understood this as the natural resistance of any established system to displacement. Not a sign of failure, a sign of contact, of the new material reaching the level where the old program lives and beginning the process of replacing it. Think about building a new physical habit. The initial discomfort isn't evidence the habit is wrong. It's evidence the body is accommodating something it hasn't done before. The discomfort is the process, not an obstacle to it. Boredom in the mental practice works identically. It's the cognitive equivalent of that discomfort, the mind encountering the same new input for the 10th, 15th consecutive session and generating the signal that nothing is happening, that attention could be more productively directed elsewhere. What that signal is actually communicating is that the repetition is working, that the input is reaching the subconscious with enough consistency to produce the friction that precedes genuine change. Continuing through boredom, not with grim determination, but with the quiet, informed understanding of what it actually represents, is where most people either develop the practice into something that genuinely alters their mental architecture or abandon it just before it would have. Hill called this the test of persistence, not a moral virtue, a functional requirement. The subconscious doesn't update on the timeline the conscious mind prefers. It updates through accumulated input that eventually crosses a threshold where the shift becomes apparent. And when it comes, the shift doesn't announce itself dramatically. That's what most people aren't prepared for. It doesn't arrive as a transformation or a clearly identifiable moment of change. It arrives as something quieter. A thought that used to surface automatically simply doesn't. A pattern that felt inevitable reveals a gap, a space where the old response would have appeared and something different surfaces instead, almost unremarkably. And in that unremarkable moment, something has moved at a level that willpower never reached. But holding the practice through the boredom requires something the practice itself cannot provide, something that has to come from a completely different source. What the practice cannot provide for itself is meaning, not motivation. Motivation is temporary, tied to how things feel on a given day, unreliable precisely when reliability matters most. Meaning is different. Meaning is the connection between the specific work of changing a specific thought pattern and something significant enough to make that work worth doing when nothing about it feels rewarding. Most people begin without this connection fully established. They understand that their thinking needs to change. They've identified the belief to be replaced. They've started the practice. And they're doing all of this in service of a general desire for a better life, which is real, but which doesn't carry enough specific gravity to hold the practice together when boredom arrives. Results aren't visible, and the old program is making its most persuasive case for stopping. Hill addressed this through the principle he called the definite chief aim. Not a goal with a number and a date attached. A specific, personally significant vision of the life that changed thinking is meant to produce. Something concrete enough to generate genuine emotion when held in the mind. Something that answers, with specificity rather than generality, the question of what all of this is actually for. Because the subconscious updates through emotionally charged experience. And the emotion available during the practice draws its fuel from the vision attached to it. A practice disconnected from a vivid, specific, genuinely desired outcome runs on abstract intention. It produces some effect, but far less than the same practice anchored to something that generates real feeling when brought to mind. Think about the difference between exercising because you know you should and exercising because a specific event in 3 months genuinely matters to you. The physical actions are identical. The consistency, the willingness to show up when motivation is low, entirely different. Not because the person changed, because the meaning attached to the action did. The mental practice works identically, anchoring it to a specific vision, held with enough clarity to generate genuine feeling during the practice, transforms dry repetition into something that carries its own internal fuel. But here's what Hill was precise about that most people miss. The vision has to be specific enough to feel real. Not realistic in the sense of being currently believable, specific in the sense of being detailed enough to be inhabited rather than merely imagined. Not financial freedom as a concept. The actual texture of what financial freedom feels like as a daily condition. Not better relationships as a category. The specific quality of a specific kind of connection that carries genuine emotional resonance. Vagueness in the vision produces vague results. Specificity produces the emotional charge that makes the subconscious treat the material as evidence rather than abstract wishful thinking. The combination, specific vision generating genuine emotion, practiced consistently in the hypermeability windows, held through boredom with the understanding of what boredom represents, begins producing something in the subconscious that conscious effort alone never could. But there's one final element. The piece most people never think to add, because it appears, on the surface, to have nothing to do with the internal work at all. The final element is the environment. Not in the broad, abstract sense of everything surrounding you. The specific, immediate environment. The inputs your mind receives consistently, without conscious direction. The content consumed before the hypermeability windows open and after they close. The conversations forming the background noise of ordinary days. The people whose voices and implicit assumptions about what's possible constitute the unexamined atmosphere you're thinking inside of. Most people treat the internal practice as separate from the environment. They do the work in the morning or before sleep, then move through the rest of the day inside an environment actively feeding the old program. Not through malicious design, but because it was assembled around the previous version of them and reflects, in its structure and contents, the thinking that version produced. Hill was explicit about this in a way that still carries an edge. The mind cannot sustain new programming against a sufficiently powerful countercurrent of environmental input. The deliberate work of introducing new material, however consistently applied, will eventually be undermined if the hours between practice sessions are spent inside an environment that keeps reinforcing what the practice is trying to replace. Think about heating a room with one small source of warmth while every window is open to winter. The heat is real, but the countercurrent is constant, and the room never reaches the temperature it could reach with the windows closed. The practice is the heat source. The environment is the windows. This doesn't require dismantling your life. Hill wasn't describing a dramatic reconstruction of everything around you. Something more surgical, the deliberate management of what receives consistent access to your attention in the hours between practice sessions. What you consume immediately after waking, before the day has fully asserted itself, is reaching a mind still partially permeable. That material carries more weight than content consumed mid-afternoon. Filling that window with input that reinforces the new program rather than the old one compounds the practice rather than competing with it. The same applies to the final hour before sleep. Whatever emotional tone has been set by the day's last inputs influences the quality of the practice that follows and the depth at which new material reaches during sleep. And beyond content, the people. Hill identified the social environment as one of the most powerful forces shaping the subconscious, precisely because it operates continuously and invisibly. The people you spend consistent time with aren't just affecting your mood. They're contributing to the atmosphere inside, which your subconscious evaluates whether the new belief is credible. A subconscious being asked to accept a new belief about what's possible, while being consistently surrounded by people for whom that belief would seem implausible, is working against significant counterpressure. Not impossible, but harder than it needs to be. Managing the environment isn't rejection or withdrawal. It's the specific decision to reduce the countercurrent enough that the practice has room to accumulate. To close some windows while the room is being heated. When the environment and the practice are aligned, when what the mind receives in the unguarded hours reinforces rather than competes with what the practice is building, something begins appearing in places you weren't looking for it. The change starts showing up in behavior before it shows up in awareness. The change showing up in behavior before awareness is the sign most people miss. They're waiting for the internal transformation to announce itself, for a clear, identifiable moment where they can say, "This is different now." They monitor the internal landscape for evidence of change, and because the change is happening below the level of monitoring, they conclude it isn't happening. Meanwhile, something is changing in what they do. A decision made differently in an ordinary moment, not dramatically, not with any sense of significance attached to it, but simply in a direction the previous version wouldn't have moved. A conversation initiated where silence was the previous default. An opportunity given genuine consideration rather than the immediate, barely conscious filtering that used to close it before it could be fully evaluated. These moments don't feel like transformation. They feel like ordinary choices, which is exactly what they are, ordinary choices being made from a slightly different internal baseline than the one operating before the work began. Hill described this as the natural sequence of genuine mental change. The subconscious updates first, silently, and without announcement. Behavior changes next, as the automatic outputs of the updated subconscious produce different responses to the same circumstances. Conscious awareness of having changed comes last, sometimes significantly later, often only in retrospect, when the pattern of different choices has accumulated enough to be visible as a pattern rather than isolated moments. Most people have this sequence backwards. They wait for internal awareness before trusting behavioral change. They look for confirmation before acting differently. And because the confirmation arrives last, they spend the most critical period, when the new program is most fragile and most in need of reinforcement through action, waiting for a signal that won't come until they've already moved. Think about learning to drive. Early sessions require conscious attention to everything: mirrors, wheel, distance, speed. Effortful, imprecise, nothing natural about it. Then, at a point that can't be precisely identified, basic operations no longer require conscious direction. The hands move before the mind issues an instruction. The skill has transferred from deliberate to automatic, from effortful to simply happening. You didn't feel that transfer occurring. You noticed it was complete only when you arrived somewhere and realized you had no memory of the last 10 minutes of the drive. Mental pattern change works identically. The transfer from old program to new happens beneath introspection and reveals itself not in a felt moment of change, but in the accumulated record of different choices made without quite knowing why they felt different. That accumulation is the evidence, not the internal feeling of having changed, the external record of having acted differently. And what that record produces over time, as different choices generate different outcomes, as different outcomes reshape the circumstances within which the next choices get made. That is what Hill described as the most powerful force available to anyone pursuing a significant aim. Not the changed thought itself, not the practice that changed it. What the changed thought, enacted consistently through changed behavior, eventually produces in the world outside the mind. That is the piece this entire conversation has been building toward, and it belongs only in what comes next. What the changed thought produces in the world outside the mind is momentum, not the motivational kind, the kind that arrives with a surge of energy and requires constant renewal to survive. Something more structural, the specific, compounding momentum that builds when a mind operating from a new internal baseline consistently produces different external results, and those results, fed back into the subconscious as evidence of what's normal, accelerate the consolidation of the new program rather than competing with it. This is the point where the work stops feeling like work, not because the challenges disappear, because the relationship between the internal state and the external effort changes. The effort is no longer being applied against the current. It's moving with one. Hill described this as the convergence of desire, faith, and persistent action into something he considered the closest available equivalent to an irresistible force. Not mystically, mechanically, because of what happens when a mind changed at the subconscious level begins operating in an environment its changed behavior has started to reshape. The circumstances begin reflecting the internal shift, not immediately, not in a straight line, but with a consistency that becomes unmistakable over time. Changed thought produces changed behavior. Changed behavior produces changed results. Changed results update the subconscious picture of what's normal. The updated picture produces more changed behavior. The cycle compounds. Most people never reach this point, not because they lack the capacity, because they stop at an earlier stage, at the boredom, at the absence of visible results, at the moment the old program makes its most persuasive case for return, before the momentum has had time to become self-sustaining. The people who reach it describe something that from the outside looks like luck and from the inside feels like alignment. Like the resistance that used to characterize every forward step has quietly reduced, not to zero, but to a level that no longer requires the same quality of effort to move through. Hill saw this in the lives he documented most carefully. The people who completed the internal work and allowed it to compound through consistent action didn't just reach their stated aims. They arrived at something beyond the aims, a fundamentally different relationship with their own capacity, with what the mind treated as the normal range of outcomes for someone like them. And here's what that arrival felt like from the inside, according to every account Hill gathered. Not triumph, not the dramatic sense of having overcome something enormous. Recognition, the quiet, almost unremarkable sense of having arrived somewhere that, in retrospect, always felt like where they were supposed to be. As if the distance between starting point and destination was real. The work was real, the difficulty was real, but the destination itself carried a strange familiarity. As if it had been waiting rather than built. As if the changed thought had always been the accurate one. And the old program, for all its years of authority, had always been the temporary thing. There is one final thing to say. The thing that belongs only at the end, because its weight depends entirely on everything that came before it. The thought you've been trying to change isn't the problem. It never was. The thought is a symptom, the visible surface of something operating much deeper. A program installed before you had any say in its installation, running so consistently it stopped feeling like a program and started feeling like truth. About you. About what you're capable of. About what becomes available to someone with your particular history. That program has been authoring most of the thoughts you've experienced as your own. Not all of them, but the ones that matter most. The ones arriving automatically when something real is at stake, generating emotional responses that precede your decisions, shaping what registers as possible before conscious thought has any input. Those came from the program, not from you. And here is what this entire conversation has been moving toward. You are not the program. You never were. It was given to you before you could evaluate it, reinforced through years of consistent application, and eventually so familiar that the distance between you and it collapsed. It began speaking in your voice, using your memories, presenting its conclusions as your honest assessment of reality. But it was always instructions, never a description of who you are. Hill spent 20 years establishing this, not as inspiration, but as documentation. The people who successfully changed their thinking didn't do it by fighting their thoughts. They did it by understanding the mechanism well enough to work with it, identifying the specific belief generating the pattern, introducing new material with genuine emotional investment in the moments of greatest permeability, anchoring the practice to something specific enough to produce real feeling, managing the environment to reduce the countercurrent, continuing through the boredom with the understanding of what boredom actually represented. Not a dramatic process, a precise one, and precision, applied consistently, produces what force alone never could. A subconscious given enough new experience to update its picture. An updated picture generating different automatic thoughts. Different thoughts producing different instinctive responses. Different responses creating different choices. Different choices accumulating into a different life. That sequence is available to you. It has always been available. The only thing standing between you and it is the program's ability to present itself as more permanent than it is. It isn't permanent. It was installed under conditions that no longer exist, through a process that can be reversed using the same mechanism that ran it forward. What this conversation has given you isn't new thoughts to think. It's a clear view of the architecture, what has been generating the thoughts you've been having, and what it actually takes to change the source rather than manage the output. Most people spend years managing the output, working sincerely, trying repeatedly, aiming the effort with genuine commitment at the wrong level. The symptom keeps returning because the source keeps producing. You now know where the source is. Whether that knowledge becomes another thing understood and set aside, or the beginning of a precise, sustained process of genuine change, that is the only remaining question. Not someday. Not when conditions feel more favorable, or doubt has cleared, or readiness finally arrives uninvited. The program has been running for a long time. It will keep running until something changes at the level where it lives. That level is now visible. That's where everything begins. If something in this video reached a place that needed to be reached, don't let it stop here. Share it with 5 people who need to hear this. And follow this channel, because what comes next goes even deeper. The work continues. And so do you.